I'm the head of defensive security here at JUMPSEC. I've been around the block a little bit in cybersecurity and seen it from many different aspects and different lenses. So hopefully today what I'm going to do is give you my perspective on the skill shortage, some things that we can think about, and I want to detail what I'm doing, what we're doing about it, and what we can start to think about as a wider industry. Maybe you sit here as a cybersecurity service provider yourself. Maybe you're working in an organization, providing services or indeed dealing with cybersecurity challenge on a day-to-day basis, or perhaps you're just looking to get into the industry. Wherever you're coming from here on this topic, hopefully there'll be something for you with what I'm about to say today. It is lunchtime, so I hope you're all enjoying your lunch right now. This is not a video call, so please feel free to eat away. I cannot see you. I certainly won't be eating as I'm talking, but maybe you're eating, sandwiches, chocolates, sausages, whatever you are. Probably not in that order. I hope. Hopefully you're enjoying your lunch there, and this can be some entertainment for you. So the topic I am covering today is the real reason for the cyber skills shortage. And we can say that arguably it is the biggest challenge facing the cybersecurity industry today. There's been a lot of discussion about the worldwide skills gap, and it is much reported and debated. And many organizations are feeling the strain of it. Let's just be clear about this, because there's not enough, seemingly there isn't enough viable candidates to fill their vacant positions. And in an area, cybersecurity in general, that is seeing significant expansion, with more and more organizations, starting to take cybersecurity more seriously. The numbers, of course, in anything like this, predictive numbers, companies working, think tanks and analysis and statistics houses looking at these kind of things. Their numbers do vary massively, but most estimates number the unfilled cybersecurity positions today in the millions worldwide, which is clearly and obviously concerning. And yeah, I guess this is the answer. I could just end the webinar here, I suppose, after this slide, but I won't do. The root of the problem is not the availability of incoming candidates, but the ability to retain skilled and experienced employees. More colleges and universities than ever are offering cybersecurity courses and online learning programs, are continuing to make cybersecurity fundamentals more accessible than ever, which is a far cry from how many older professionals, including myself, first cut their teeth in the industry. But ultimately, no certification or e-learning program is a suitable replacement or substitute, I suppose, for hands-on experience. And while there are more people attempting to enter the industry than ever, specialist disciplines, mid-level positions continue to pose a challenge in terms of recruitment and retention. So, where does this lead us? Well, in the UK, specifically the UK, the cybersecurity workforce shrank by 65,000 people last year, which is obviously completely in the wrong direction. Also, this is compounded that, according to another study from earlier this year, 1 in 3 current cybersecurity professionals are planning to change professions. So the data tells us that skilled and experienced professionals are leaving the industry due to burnout and disillusionment, and many other reasons as well. But this is highly unsustainable. Based on what I've just said in the previous slide, this is not what we need right now as an industry. I mentioned a couple of factors there, but there are a number of factors driving what you could say is an unhealthy working environment in cybersecurity in general. And here, arguably the most impactful is essentially the unsustainability of many operating models, which still today remain heavily reliant on the manual analysis of vast numbers of security events and alerts. I'm obviously, as a head of defensive security, I'm coming at this topic slightly from a defensive standpoint, but But you can apply the same logic to offensive security services or any branch of security, really. So when I'm talking about things like security events and alerts, if that's not your day job, if that's not your game, don't worry about it. It still applies. The same logic applies, just perhaps in a slightly different way. But hopefully the outcome, the things we need to achieve to address that, are consistent, because cybersecurity is one big family, really. Whether you're blue, purple, or red, it's essentially one in the same. And I always say that the best defenders need to know how to attack, and the reverse is true as well. The best attackers, the best offensive security specialists, understand how to defend, or indeed how to bypass defenses. But the unsustainability there is also compounded by organizations going through aggressive customer acquisition and business growth strategies, with often models around security that are not inherently scalable. All of that whilst needing to maintain price competitiveness, naturally means that organizations must extract more from their employees to maintain profitability. But the models are already unsustainable, so there's nowhere to go there. You add on top of that the current recession, and the other market conditions that we're facing, and this really sort of compounds the challenges that we're facing here as an industry. So where does this lead us? Well, clearly sustainability is key. But one of the key reasons sustainability is key in cybersecurity is because compromise is inevitable. I speak to dozens of organizations monthly about their cybersecurity posture and where they are as an organization. And increasingly, I'm coming up against organizations that both historically and currently, who seem to have this perspective that the way to win here is just to keep the attackers out. Unfortunately, in my experience, and I've been involved in many hundreds, if not thousands, of security incidents in my incident response career around the globe, is that what that's told me is that compromise is essentially inevitable. It's the timing and severity we can't predict. Every organization at some point is going to experience some level of compromise. So if we can't guarantee that we can keep the attackers out, we must prepare for the worst and be ready for it, and build our infrastructure and approaches and operating models around this assumption, and not be chasing an unachievable aim of 100% security. The only real way to achieve 100% security is to turn all the computers off and close the business and go home. And most organizations aren't going to sort of take that approach. Let's be honest. So we have to become more realistic. We've got to keep sustainability in mind, because it is paramount. You are going to have to sustain your workforce and ability to deal with security issues, and in the worst case, incident response, often at the worst possible time. With that being said, though, we've got to kind of think about the wider problem here and consider kind of the cyber threat as well. So there's obviously a great deal to this, but there are some key aspects that I want to point out here, because they do feed into this point about sustainability and the problems that we face. So, through ransomware, and you may have seen JUMPSEC recently released a ransomware report focusing on the UK. You can check that out on jumpsec.com. It is an interesting insight into the data and what's been going on in the UK over the last year or so. But ransomware, essentially, attackers landed on a model that enables them to easily monetize their attacks with or without encryption these days, because ultimately, generally speaking, with ransomware groups, we're dealing with criminal organizations. There's massive variation. There's some consistencies. There are not many, though. We have things like ransomware as a service and a whole raft of other things tied into this, initial access brokers, so on and so forth. But the crux of it is attackers want to easily monetize their attacks. And this is ransomware is the current trend because it's a model that's working and it's a model that's succeeding. Compounding that, though, is also the way cyber insurance is becoming increasingly unreliable as a method of managing the risks associated with cyber breaches. So again, with the organizations I'm speaking to, many of them are coming to speak to me about how their insurance premiums have doubled, tripled, quadrupled in the last year, and how, quite frankly, cyber insurance is becoming reasonably unviable for them as an organization. So what that leads to is many organizations who saw cyber insurance as possibly their main, or in many cases only, risk mitigation against compromise are having the rug pulled from under their feet. And when that happens, when organizations have taken the approach that cyber insurance is their savior, generally what you find underlying that is poor security practice and a less than efficient approach to cybersecurity operations, because maybe the feeling has been, although I would leverage that it's an inaccurate feeling, but the feeling has been that cyber insurance has them covered. And it's not just about organizations who can't afford the premiums either. We've seen recent sort of report out of Lloyd's of London about sort of the insurance market and how increasingly certain things aren't being covered broadly. The most recent example is what they refer to as state-sponsored attacks no longer being covered by modern policies, at least. And this is a trend that we're going to see continuing. The cyber insurance market has established their market base now. Now they've got to retract their position and make a sustainable business themselves. And clearly, the model that they've been following for that industry is unsustainable, and that leaves us to obviously some problems with the sustainability of security in many organizations here. Also, organizations are increasingly compromised, essentially as a result of either standard control gaps or lapsing of expected controls. In all of the attacks and incidents I've dealt with and I'm using the role we here quite a bit when I say attacks I've investigated, attacks my teams have investigated over the years. It's rare to come across a situation where essentially the root cause, the way an attacker gained access initially was down to a mistake, a simple mistake, an error, be it a user falling victim to a phishing law, overly pervasive admin privileges in an environment and enabling attackers to move laterally and elevate privileges at lightning speed. The sort of most punchy attacks that really often spring to my mind is when one-time passwords are stored in text files on desktops. It is often essentially here the basics that go wrong here. And meanwhile, we have an industry that seems and a marketing industry around cybersecurity that seems still obsessed with silver bullet solutions and blinky boxes that are going to solve all of our problems. Unfortunately, the silver bullet store is now closed in security, and it is the fundamentals that really matter. That goes both for organizations and also people in the industry. I'll talk about it a bit more in a second, but when I'm speaking to organizations, one thing I always talk about is before you continue to invest in new security technology, sit back and consider, are you making best use of what you already have? And if you're not making best use of it, probably better to make best use of it first before you start to compound the problem by adding more and more stuff. The worst way to find a needle in your cybersecurity haystack is to make the haystack bigger, essentially. A few months ago, back earlier this year, I gave a briefing talk which essentially discussed an incident war story. It was about a ransomware attack against a major international enterprise. That talk is on YouTube. I believe we'll post a link around after this event if anyone's interested in sitting through one of my my war stories. But essentially, the crescendo of that talk is the lessons learned from the incident. And although the lessons you see here were specific to that particular ransomware attack and that particular war story. These are pretty consistent against most incidents that, as I say, me and my teams have investigated alongside those control gaps. And just to kind of briefly run you through these, incident responders landing in a situation where they have little or no network visibility to work with, something that could be prepared for in advance, a general inability to respond, going down to even the simple, most common sense things, collaboration and communication as one example. I'm not talking about media comms here, although that is an aspect of this. I'm talking about your organization has been ransomwared, enterprise communication is all down. Do you have a fallback option in place for crisis? And often the answer is no. No preparations, too many assumptions. I've heard every organization on the planet tell me that their senior leadership team is like a family and they pull together in the midst of crisis. It's a very rare occasion when that actually happens in the real world. It leads to faulty thinking, and it leads organizations to leave themselves open to attack, or indeed open to making mistakes in response. I think it's worth highlighting here the importance of response and how response can be a real win for organizations. Often you think if we're reaching instant response, well, we're in trouble and whatever happens. Well, I always like to point out the recent example from a year or two ago with FireEye, with the SolarWinds breach. If you're not familiar with that, I really recommend you go look it up because it was a really interesting case study. FireEye as a security company was obviously breached as part of that that supply chain compromise, which affected many organizations worldwide. It wasn't just FireEye, of course. What was incredibly impressive from my perspective as a career incident responder, and I was not involved in the FireEye situation. I just admired it from afar and spoke to some of my my colleagues who worked there subsequently, was the way they handled the response, the activities they took place, the clear plan, or the seemingly clear plan that they executed, and the impact that then had on the industry and also on their customers. So what that ultimately led to was that they built trust with their customers. I think we'd often assume as an industry, if a security company is compromised, trust would be lost quite significantly. But that just goes as to prove that, and that this is not just unique to cybersecurity companies that are compromised. Any organization that is compromised, response is really an opportunity, as well as a way of obviously managing and navigating your way out of the compromise and the breach itself. The other kind of key piece that we see, serious technical debt. Honestly, I do not like the phrase technical debt. Sorry, I think it's a lazy phrase, and often as a cybersecurity industry, we can be accused of sitting in our cybersecurity ivory tower here and preaching down to the masses. We need to kind of get in the real world a little bit and understand a little bit more about how the challenges organizations face. But truth be told, it is the technical debt, so-called, that often has an impact in breaches. This particular incident, but this is true for most, had serious issues with patching and hadn't patched the Eternal Blue vulnerabilities dating back to 2015, 2016. At this point in that particular incident, it was 5 years later. Critical vulnerabilities remaining unpatched. We had, although it was disarmed, thanks to the work of the broader security industry several years previously, this organization had the WannaCry worm jumping around their organization, which just spoke to kind of the real sort of lack of operational capability within that particular organization. But this is true for many organizations globally as well. I'm not just picking on the company that was breached during this war story here. They had security infrastructure that was severely lacking, existing security infrastructure that was misconfigured, and most notably their antivirus product was not installed on half of their environment, and indeed it wasn't configured appropriately on anywhere where it was installed. Some of that would have had an impact on their ability to respond quicker to the attackers' actions, but unfortunately they missed opportunities because they weren't ready in that sense. The next two I kind of always take together, which like misaligned expectations at senior level with few meaningful checks and balances in place. Senior echelons of the organization assuming everything is okay. Cybersecurity is fine because we haven't been bitten by an incident yet, when unfortunately that couldn't have been further from the truth. And also finally, a key lesson here was little understanding of the threat and available attack paths. So I can encourage you to listen to that talk if you're interested, but these are kind of trends that I see in most incidents, and we can kind of transpose this to operational security and the approaches that organizations are taking. Really, these lessons are things that we want to bring to the fore prior to a breach, to make sure that when breaches happen, the approach is much more graceful, and naturally then the impact on the people is indeed lower. And this is as true as much for an organization managing their own cybersecurity as it is for a service provider as well. What does this lead to? Where are some of the challenges then that this is kind of taking us to? The skill shortage, the way cyber threats are evolving, and also then the experience of organizations when they are breached. Well, what you have here is a cascade of problems stemming from a perfect storm of issues, including those sort of wider societal factors such as the recession, the Great Resignation, and rising inflation. These are all putting, as I mentioned before, a squeeze on company margins and forcing them to try and extract more from an already overworked and exhausted workforce. But here, this cascade speaks to unsustainable operating models relying on mandrolic effort, and whilst aiming for unattainable standards. We see regularly. I don't want to pick on a particular organization, but the MITRE attack assessments is one example of this. Every vendor who goes through the MITRE attack assessment, their marketing team is when those results are launched, and I've been in a company that has experienced several MITRE assessments in the past myself, and that company has released these kind of similar marketing buzz press releases talking about 100% detection coverage against 100% of the TTPs. That is not accurate. That is not the real way detection works. 100% detection is not possible in the real world. We shouldn't be setting that up as a bar that we have to work towards. Vendors shouldn't have to feel like they have to provide 100% of 100% detection coverage to win customers. It just leads to bad behaviors, and it essentially, as an industry, we have to be careful here because we're, in many senses, we're pulling or trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, and that just leads to bad behaviors and bad assumptions. Also, kind of this leads to sort of generic monitoring that is not fit for purpose. In a world where the worst way to find a cybersecurity needle in the haystack, I'm repeating myself here, but it's an important point, is to make the haystack bigger. It's really important that organizations do not collect everything and assume the answers are going to punch them in the face. And this is kind of a major challenge that we see reflected in the way people experience cybersecurity, and it's clearly leading to burnout and unsustainable models. We have also failing quality standards and widespread burnout amongst security analysts, naturally linked to generic monitoring practices and unreasonable expectations. Also, those reliance on product-centric or indeed automated silver bullet cybersecurity solutions that either aren't being used effectively or just don't work as people expect them to. Marketing soup rather than effectiveness. A lack of visibility and accountability relating to vendor performance or indeed operational cybersecurity performance in the organization as a whole. How do we know if there's a problem? A lot of these things are invisible. We've got to try and think of ways to surface them, and then leading to control gaps, lapses that are going unnoticed until it's too late. And as I mentioned, many of the incidents, if not most of the incidents I've experienced and dealt with, do relate back to a control gap. But if you add the previous couple of slides together, and you know, my points on how the threats are evolving and what the key challenges are, that really sort of speaks to what I was saying earlier about that compromise is inevitable here. So what can we do about it? Or indeed, what are we doing about it? What do we need to do about it as an industry? Well, there are 7 principles that we've been working towards at JUMPSEC, and we want the rest of the industry to engage in this and think a bit more about how they can implement either these 7 principles or augment them with their own or their own ideas. We released this thinking only in the last month, and it's something I'm incredibly passionate about, and something, you know, that we're going to increasingly tackle as an organization, and we will continue to refine and update our principles and thinking on this. But right now, the 7 key principles for us are we want to augment people with technology. So use technology not as a replacement for manual effort, but as an enabler to enhance. So, you know, think less about fancy cherry on the top AI solutions that are going to answer all your problems, but think more about, well, how can we make our people's life easier? How can we leave them to focus on what matters? And that kind of leads to the second point, which is being pragmatic and detect what matters. Essentially, generic monitoring, generic detection leads to widespread burnout and other issues. We need to focus on the attack paths that are most relevant to the organization that you're protecting. Don't try to detect everything, particularly when those detections don't form part of a meaningful use case. So there's 2 ways to think about this. From a defensive point of view, don't detect everything, but also there from an attacker's or an offensive security perspective, focusing on the attack paths that matter. There's an essential link between the offensive side of security and defensive here. We need to work together to solve these problems, and that ultimately is about us, you know, being a bit cleverer about what we do. Ultimately, attackers will continue to win until it's cheaper to defend than it is to attack. We're not going to reach that metric by simply carrying on as we are. Being more focused, being more strategic about what we do, utilizing that offensive knowledge and defensive knowledge together is a clear win, and going to lead to better results and bring down that cost of defense as well here. We also believe organizations need to respond on the front foot. Ensure that proactive response is baked in. So when you identify something, detect something, you'll have high confidence in it being malicious as a result of the previous steps, and make sure that there is clear containment and response actions. An analogy I often use with companies that we work with is, you know, forget about technology for a moment. Imagine a well-managed forest. A well-managed forest has foresters cleaning the dead wood constantly, and they also build in fire breaks into that forest. Why do they do that? Well, they acknowledge that this forest is made of wood, therefore the risk of a fire is pretty high at some point, depending on the conditions and the things around it. So therefore, if there is a fire, we want to make sure that we've got appropriate fire breaks in place so that we minimize the impact of that risk should it be realized. And that's what we really need to start thinking about in terms of how we prepare to respond. What are our opportunities to respond? What are our fire breaks in our organizations, and how do we prepare for them in advance? Number 4 is avoiding dependency to enable progress. So you know, this really applies to us in terms of being a managed security provider, but it's I think that, you know, the way organizations need to interpret this is you know, it's a bit of a dirty secret in our industry, really, that a security vendor, a cybersecurity service provider, is really only as good as the organization they're protecting. If the front doors are left open, there's not much really a detective security sort of tablecloth can do there to prevent wide-scale compromise. It will happen at some point. So we need to kind of get out of this habit of trying to sort of persuade people that is the key thing that's necessary here. Unhook ourselves from sort of using rhetoric as a vendor that's about sort of, we're going to solve all of your problems, and be a bit more realistic about what the capabilities are here and what the results are going to be. It's also about being visible and transparent. So make sure that the organization that we're protecting have evidence that the service is performing as intended, running regular regression testing and offensive security assessments. One good example here is purple teaming, daily atomic red teaming, and things like that. Prove your use cases are effective on the daily. Don't wait for the organization to be compromised to find out you've got major problems in your detection stack. And report and be visible about that reporting, but do it in a way that executive leadership can understand as much as the technical people within the organization. It's also about being flexible and adaptive. You've got to be sympathetic that as vendors and as organizations, that the organizations have generally invested quite heavily in certain technologies. So this is what I was saying earlier. Don't start by pushing for major investments in new tech. Be flexible and work with what's already there first before pushing unnecessary new technology. You might find that the capability is already there with a little bit of digging, and you also can quite often save the organization money. Although that should never be a key goal of security, it can be a massive win for the security strategy as a whole. 7 is, and the final point here is embedding continuous improvement. So ultimately here, our aim at JUMPSEC is to make ourselves obsolete. We want to work continuously to improve our capabilities such that we can move on to the next challenges that are coming along the track here. And so essentially considering that new challenges are going to be upon us constantly, we've got to be solving these problems and putting them to bed, really. And a really key way of doing that is to embed continuous improvement into everything you do, often referred to as a Toyota model or Kaizen. This is something that we really need to do as an industry and today to maintain levels of security, but also to constantly improve them. And there is a real key facet here, which is small steps are better than big leaps. Make a 1% improvement every day, every week, and those gains will compound massively. And that goes as much for organizations protecting their security as it does for individuals picking up skills and learning about their craft and wanting to join the industry. I think I'm just out of time, so suffice to say, I'm very passionate about this topic. I hope you found some food for thought here and some kind of things that we can perhaps discuss offline. If you want to get in touch with me, you can use that email address there, hello@jumpsec.com. If you want to do it the old-fashioned way, you can give us a call. If you've got any sort of questions for me, I'm happy to take them now in chat, or you can drop me an email and I'll happily correspond with you. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, if you're there, and happy to connect and chat that way about this. And if you're facing these challenges, if you're feeling burnt out and that side of things, just know that the people in the industry are here and ready to support you. And I'm somebody who is there if you need someone to talk to. So please do reach out if you're facing up against that. Yeah, without further ado, Debbie, I'll pass back to you.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, it's really, really interesting. And as Matt said, if you are facing that, I know Matt would be happy to talk to you. You can contact us at CREST as well. Please feel free to do that. And also we have got a workshop coming up later at around 2 o'clock for stress and burnout, so please feel free to come along to that. So does anyone have any questions for Matt? We can probably do a couple of minutes, unfortunately, because we are tight for time today, because we've got a lot of webinars and workshops that we're getting through. So I can't see any coming into the question pane. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Matt so much for coming on here and presenting today and talking about these challenges. It is good to talk, and we should be talking about this more. So I really appreciate that, Matt. That's been brilliant. And also thank you to our attendees for coming on the webinar. Please feel free, as I say, we've got some more workshops and webinars throughout the day. We haven't finished yet, still a few hours to go. So please feel free to come on to those. Okay, well, thank you everyone, and take care and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks all.